Okay, get ready, folk, because today we're diving into a case that's going to stick with you. It's a truly chilling story.
Yeah.
Back in 2003, a horrific crime shocked Brownsville, Texas, and we're not just going to cover like the basic facts.
No, it's fascinating how this case, even all these years later, still brings up questions about justice, forgiveness, what evil even is.
Right, and we've got a really interesting mix of sources to help us unpack this.
Oh, yeah.
We've got excerpts from this book, The Long Shadow of Small Ghosts by Laura Tillman. She actually corresponded with one of the murderers and reflects on that experience.
Yeah.
We're also going to be looking at some recent news articles because, believe it or not, there are legal battles still going on.
Wow.
And even some YouTube videos. It's got to have those YouTube videos. And they offer some very different perspectives on the case.
Okay, so what's the goal? What are we hoping to learn from all this?
Well, I think we want to go beyond just the headlines
Right.
to understand the layers of this story, how a community tries to heal after something so horrific. Can we ever really understand what goes on in the mind of a murderer?
Yeah, and is there even such a thing as justice after 20 years? I mean,
Right. Okay, so let's start with the basics. But be warned, this is tough stuff.
okay.
It was March 11th, 2003, 8th and Tyler Streets
Yeah.
in Brownsville, apartment complex.
Okay.
Now, picture this. You're a police officer. You get a disturbance call. You walk in, and the first thing that hits you, boom, the smell of bleach.
Oh, wow.
Strong, acrid, like someone's trying to scrub away something really off.
Now, you can't help but think, what are they trying to hide?
And what they found was truly unimaginable.
Okay.
3 young children.
Mm.
Jalissa, only 3 years old. John Estefan, just 14 months old. And baby Mary Jane, only 2 months old. All found decapitated in their own home.
God, that's it's almost too much to process.
The details are incredibly disturbing. Detective Sam Lucio, one of the first responders, even after years on the force, he said, this is the one that stuck with him.
I'm not surprised.
The memory of that night, the smell, the sight of those innocent children never faded.
It's like something out of a nightmare.
And another officer, Thomas Clipper, he said he still remembers the silence of the apartment, just broken by the sounds of the officers' radios.
It's like the air itself is haunted.
It really makes you think about what it does to the first responders, right? To have to witness these kinds of horrors.
The trauma must be immense, not just for the officers, but for the entire community. You know, they actually tore down that entire apartment building later on.
Yeah. Replaced it with a community garden.
It's like they were trying to physically erase the memory of that place, of that night.
Right. Replace it with something hopeful.
Something life-affirming.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? But you can't just erase the emotional impact.
Right. The shadow this crime cast over everyone involved.
And that shadow, it extends to the story of John Allen Rubio, one of the parents who was there when the police arrived. He confessed.
He confessed to the murders.
Yeah. And his confession is where things get really complicated.
Complicated how?
Well, he initially claimed that he believed the children were possessed
Possessed.
by the spirit of his deceased grandmother.
Oh, wow. That's a lot to unpack.
Right. How do you even begin to process that? And it gets even more disturbing because Rubio goes into graphic detail about how he killed each child.
Oh, okay.
He strangled and stabbed Jalissa, the oldest, and then he used a machete and a kitchen knife on the 2 younger children.
It's almost impossible to even imagine.
And then, as if the details themselves weren't disturbing enough, his story starts to shift. Later on, he claims that witches had stolen the machete.
Witches?
Yeah, right in the middle of the murders.
What? It's like he was trying to create this like supernatural narrative,
But
but
the pieces don't fit.
they don't fit at all.
So was he delusional? I mean, was this a genuine mental breakdown? Or was he trying to manipulate the situation? I mean,
To deflect responsibility. It's
Yeah.
so hard to say for sure.
and then you have Angela Camacho, his common-law wife, who was also there. She claimed Rubio forced her, that she didn't actually participate in the violence.
So you have these 2 very different accounts of what happened.
Yeah.
2 different truths.
It's like trying to piece together a shattered mirror.
Right, and that's where Laura Tillman's work comes in. She spent years corresponding with Rubio,
Wow.
wrestling with, can you give a voice to a man who committed such horrific
Yeah.
acts?
Can you even imagine reading his letters, trying to understand his perspective, knowing what he did.
Right, it's like this constant internal struggle for her, balancing her duty as a journalist with her own moral compass. I remember reading about how Rubio actually praised her writing in one of his letters.
Oh, yeah.
It made her so uncomfortable.
Yeah, I bet. Like, was he being genuine? Or was it just a way to manipulate her, get her sympathy?
You never really know with someone like that.
It makes you wonder if you can ever really separate the story from the storyteller, especially when the storyteller is a convicted murderer.
That's a really good point. It's a question that's been debated for a long time, and not just in this case, but in any case where a journalist is dealing with a difficult subject.
It's a reminder that even when we're trying to be objective, journalism is still a human endeavor. It's full of biases, emotions, ethical challenges.
Absolutely, and those challenges, they don't end with the reporting. This case has been in the courts for over 20 years.
Right. Let's talk about those legal battles that are still happening today in 2023. Rubio was originally sentenced to death in 2003, but then there was a retrial.
A retrial?
And he was sentenced again in 2010.
Why was there a retrial?
Well, because of a technicality. And it just shows how important due process is.
Right.
Even when you're dealing with a crime as awful as this one, the courts have to make sure the trial is fair, that everyone's rights are upheld.
Even when there's so much public outrage.
Exactly. But it also makes you think, what does justice even mean in a case like this?
That is the question. What is justice?
I mean, is it retribution? Is it deterrence? Is it rehabilitation? And when it comes to capital punishment, the death penalty, it's just, it gets even more complicated.
Absolutely.
And these questions are still very much alive. Rubio's lawyers are still filing appeals. They were claiming he had inadequate defense and that there was even prosecutorial misconduct.
Oh, wow. So they're saying that those things could have impacted the trials.
Right. And if they can prove it, there's a chance he could get another retrial.
Another retrial.
Or even a reduced sentence.
I see.
So the legal battle is far from over.
It's not just about guilt or innocence at this point.
Right. It's also about making sure the process itself was fair and just.
And of course, you have the state. They're arguing that Rubio's guilt is clear, that there's no doubt. They want this to be over.
They want closure for the community.
Which I understand. They've been living with this for over 20 years.
But, legal closure doesn't always mean emotional closure.
No, absolutely not.
And all of this is going on with Rubio. But we can't forget about Angela Camacho.
Right. What happened to her?
Well, she took a plea deal. She's serving life in prison.
Life.
But she could be eligible for parole in 2043.
So their paths have really diverged.
Yeah, it just shows that even when you're talking about one crime, one terrible event, there are so many stories playing out.
Each with its own nuances and implications.
Right, and all of those individual stories contribute to the broader narrative of this case, how it's impacted the community.
And the fact that we're still searching for answers, answers that we may never truly find.
It's like everyone involved is holding a piece of the puzzle, but no one has the whole picture.
Exactly, and that's part of what makes this case so compelling. It's a challenge to look beyond the surface, to think about human behavior, the things that we do, the choices we make. And, sometimes there just aren't easy answers.
And as we move into the next part of this deep dive, we're going to confront some of those difficult questions head on. We're going to look into what could have motivated John Allen Rubio to do something so horrific. We'll talk about those claims of demonic possession. We'll look at his past, and we'll analyze those YouTube videos because they offer some really interesting and contrasting perspectives on this whole tragedy.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's get into it. So we're trying to figure out, why? Why did John Allen Rubio do this? You'd think with all the information, the confessions, psychological reports, all these different theories, it'd be clear.
Right, you'd think so, but
it's just not. It's way more complicated.
Yeah, it's like we're all searching for that one missing piece, that one thing that explains it all.
Well, what if there isn't one?
What if it's just a whole bunch of things, like a perfect storm of, bad circumstances, mental health struggles?
Yeah, and the stuff we've been looking at, it definitely points to that. You've got Rubio's claims about his grandmother possessing the kids.
Which, remember, those claims changed over time.
Exactly, like he was trying to find a way to make sense of it himself.
Or to make it sound, less horrible. Like maybe if he could convince himself it was something supernatural, then he wouldn't have to face the reality of what he did.
Guilt, self-deception, it's all tangled up in there. And then you add in his past, his childhood.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other layer. Unstable family life, mental health issues from a young age. It's like he was set up for failure from the beginning, almost.
And then there's this interesting period in high school where he seems to find some stability, some purpose. He's in ROTC, he's on the swim team, things are looking up.
Right, like he's finally getting on track, but then he graduates, that structure's gone, and he's lost.
It's like he didn't have the tools, the coping mechanisms to deal with the real world. And then you add mental health issues on top of that.
And that fragility, that lack of support, it's something those YouTube videos really bring to light, though they come at it from completely different angles.
Oh, totally. One's all about demons and evil spirits, portraying Rubio as this victim of supernatural forces. And the other one focuses on the lack of mental health resources, especially in poorer communities like Brownsville.
It's like two sides of the same coin. One searching for answers in the spiritual realm, the other in the systemic, but both trying to make sense of something that just doesn't make sense.
And they both tap into this very human need to understand. We want there to be a reason, a cause, because if we can understand why something happened, maybe we can prevent it from happening again.
But what if there isn't one simple reason? What if it's way more complex than that?
That's what makes this case so unsettling. It forces us to confront the limits of what we can know, the parts of human behavior that we just can't fully explain.
And in all of this and all this talk about the why, it feels like we sometimes lose sight of the victims.
Yes, absolutely.
Julissa, John Estefan, Mary Jane, they were just babies.
Children with their own lives, their own dreams, lives that were cut tragically short.
And it's that loss, that absence, that we need to remember.
We can't let them be forgotten. We need to honor their memory, to make sure their stories aren't overshadowed by the horror of what happened to them.
I keep thinking about that community garden. It's a beautiful gesture, an attempt to reclaim that space, to turn it into something positive. But it also makes me wonder, are there other ways we can remember these children? Ways that are more personal, more focused on who they were?
That's a good question. How do we remember the victims in a way that acknowledges their individual lives, their potential, their absence in the world? It's a challenge.
It's a challenge we need to face head on, not just in this case, but in every case of violence. How do we make sure the victims aren't just statistics, not just footnotes, but that their individual stories are remembered, honored?
It's about shifting the focus away from the why and towards the who.
Exactly. Remembering their names, their faces, their potential.
Recognizing that their loss was profound, that it ripples outward, impacting families, communities, even those of us who are just learning about this now, years later.
We're all touched by this in some way.
And that recognition, I think, is where healing starts. Not by forgetting what happened, but by honoring the memory of those who were lost.
It makes me think about the different ways we try to make sense of these kinds of tragedies. Sometimes we look for answers in the supernatural. Remember that YouTube video?
Oh, yeah.
Other times we try to understand it through societal failures, lack of resources, all the things that can contribute to these situations.
And I think both perspectives, even if they're not perfect, show how badly we want to understand, to find some meaning in all this chaos and suffering.
But maybe, sometimes, the most meaningful thing we can do is just remember.
Remember those who were lost.
Acknowledge the pain, say their names, never forget their stories.
And let that remembrance fuel us, push us to do better, to advocate for better mental health resources, to work towards a world where children are safe, where communities are supported, where these kinds of tragedies happen less.
It's about moving beyond the why and focusing on the how. How do we create that world? How do we make sure that what happened to Julissa, John Estefan, and Mary Jane doesn't happen again?
That's the real challenge. And it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of compassion, a lot of commitment.
And as we go into the last part of our deep dive, I think we need to hold on to that sense of hope, that possibility for change.
Definitely.
Because even in the face of all this darkness, the human spirit is incredibly resilient. We can grow, we can find meaning, and that's what truly honors the memory of those whose lives were cut short.
It's interesting. We've talked about that community garden a few times now,
Mm-hmm.
the one that replaced the apartment building.
Yeah, it stuck with me too.
Makes you think about how we deal with trauma like that on such a large scale, not just individually, but as a community as a whole.
It's like this need to move forward, to reclaim the space.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can't escape the memory of what happened there.
Exactly. It's like, yeah, you can tear down a building, but those memories, they linger.
And that's why it's so important to talk about the victims, to make sure they're not forgotten.
Absolutely. We can't let them be overshadowed by the horror of the crime, by the sensationalism, Julissa, John, Estefan, Mary Jane. They were real people, each with their own life, their own story to tell.
It's easy to get caught up in the details of the case, The investigation, the legal battles, the search for answers.
But sometimes it feels like we lose sight of the human cost.
The fact that these were children whose lives were stolen from them.
And that's what I hope we can do in this last part of our deep dive. To really center the victims, to bring their stories back into the light.
It's not about ignoring the darkness of what happened, but about remembering the light that was extinguished.
Yes,
To
exactly.
remember those children, not just as victims, but as individuals who deserved so much more, who deserved the chance to live, to love, to experience all that life has to offer.
And to recognize the ripple effect of that loss, the impact it had on their families, their community, even on us as we learn about this case all these years later.
We've talked about the different ways people try to make sense of tragedy. Sometimes it's through the supernatural, like that one YouTube video we discussed.
Right, that was a fascinating perspective.
And then sometimes it's about looking at societal failures, lack of resources, systemic issues that contribute to these kinds of situations.
And I think both of those perspectives, however imperfect they may be, show how deeply we crave understanding.
But
How much we want to find meaning in the face of something so senseless.
maybe sometimes the most meaningful thing we can do is just remember,
To simply remember.
to acknowledge the pain, to say their names, Jalissa, John, Estefan, Mary Jane, to keep their stories alive.
And to let that act of remembrance be a call to action.
Right. To push for change, to advocate for better mental health resources, to work towards creating a world where children are safe, where communities have the support they need, where tragedies like this don't happen.
That's the legacy we can choose to build from this darkness, a legacy of hope, of compassion, of a commitment to protecting the most vulnerable among us.
It's about finding that glimmer of light amidst the shadows and carrying it forward. And I think that's a good place to leave this conversation for now. But this is far from over for any of us, right?
No, absolutely not.
We've explored a lot in this deep dive. The details of the crime, the impact on the community, the complexities of the legal system, the search for answers that may never fully come. But I think what's really stayed with me is the resilience of the human spirit, the power of remembrance, and the possibility of creating a better world.
So to everyone listening,
Thank you for joining us on this journey. It's been heavy. It's been emotional. But it's also been incredibly important.
thank you for listening.
We may never fully understand what happened in that Brownsville apartment back in 2003, but we can choose how we remember it, how we learn from it, how we move forward.
That's the key.
And in that choice lies the potential for healing, for growth, for creating a world that honors the memory of those we've lost.